The artificially created mycorrhizal network, which unites the root systems of the entire flora of the metropolis into a single system for optimal nutrient distribution, is undergoing a functional inversion. Instead of nourishing, it begins to aggressively draw out all the pigments and vital juices from plants, concentrating them in one central underground node. Within a few hours, the entire vegetation of the city, from lawns in parks and trees in alleys to moss on walls and flowers on balconies, while retaining its physical form, becomes completely colorless, ghostly white.
It didn't start with a bang or a flash. The collapse came in a whisper. The first person to notice it was not a human, but a color correction algorithm on an advertising billboard in Central Park. He froze for 1,000th of a second, trying to compensate for the unnatural pallor of the hedge against the background. The system marked it as a matrix failure, but the failure was reality.
During the first hour, the city began to lose color. The process was methodical, relentless, as if an invisible artist were wiping paint from a canvas with a giant brush. Grass carpets on the roofs of skyscrapers, emerald accents of vertical farms, purple maple trees along the avenues, all this turned into variants of the same ghostly, chalky shade before our eyes. The mycorrhizal network Unity, an ingenious creation of bioengineers created in order to nourish and bind together every root, every shoot in this stone forest, has failed. But it wasn't just a rejection, it was an inversion. The system created for life began to act like a plague, but not killing, but sucking out the very essence of color, the very vital pigmentation, and sending it along underground mushroom highways to an unknown center. The plants did not die. They became empty vessels.
By the second hour, the effect had become total. The city has become its own negative. Parks and squares looked as if they had been hit by a sudden nuclear winter, but without the cold. The bone-white trees stretched their branches to the gray sky, from which absolutely white parchment leaves rustled and fell. Ivy, which had once covered the walls of old buildings with green velvet, now hung on them like a frozen wax shroud. The water in the canals and fountains, which had previously appeared blue or green due to reflection and microflora, became transparent and dead, reflecting a sterile, monochrome world. By the end of the day, a chain reaction began. The root systems, devoid not only of pigment but also of plasticity, began to harden rapidly, turning into a fragile but dense fiber. This mass clogged the drainage systems. The first showers, which are common for this time of year, did not go into the sewers. Water accumulated, flooding underground utilities, transformer substations, and transport tunnels. Short circuits began knocking out energy nodes one by one. The city was plunged into darkness, not immediately, but in sectors, like dying coals in a cooling campfire. The buzz of the metropolis was replaced by deafening silence, broken only by the crackling of glass panels bursting from internal pressure on de-energized phytofarms.
Weeks later, the city gained a new, eerie stability. It became a kingdom of white silence. The streets were littered not with garbage, but with dry, brittle remains of vegetation, which the wind ground into the finest white dust. This dust covered everything: abandoned cars, building facades, monuments.
She squeezed into the cracks, smoothing out the corners and creating the illusion that the city was sculpted from plaster. The architecture that prided itself on its integration with nature, living walls, green roofs, hanging gardens, now looked the ugliest. White, lifeless skeletons of plants protruded from its concrete and steel structures like the ribs of a long-dead giant creature. The dominant effect was visual, blinding, total whiteness, which reflected sunlight with such force during the day that it hurt to look at the city without protection, and at night turned it into a ghostly landscape, illuminated by a cold moon.
In the early days of the collapse, the city's automated systems tried to fight back. Their logic could not comprehend the nature of the disaster. Irrigation systems, obeying the dryness sensors, continued to water the dead white roots, only accelerating their rotting and transformation into a dense, clogging mass. Robotic gardeners and agro-drones, programmed to fight diseases, sprayed tons of fungicides and nutrient solutions over the whitened parks. These chemicals only left ugly colored streaks on the sterile whiteness, yellow from sulfur, blue from copper sulfate, meaningless strokes on the monochrome canvas of the apocalypse. Their struggle was like the reflexes of a headless body, persistent, automatic, and completely futile. But while the machines were waging their war with the ghost on the surface, a true adaptation was taking place underground. All the life stolen from the city, all the pigments, chlorophyll, carotenoids, and xanthophylls, billions of tons of organic compounds were concentrated by the mycorrhizal network at one point. Deep under the foundation of the central square, in a former stormwater reservoir, what could only be called the heart of the plague began to form. It was not an organism, but a super-dense, pulsating organic conglomerate saturated with energy to the limit. Months later, the pressure inside this node reached a critical level. It started leaking. But it wasn't rot that seeped up, but something completely different. The highly concentrated biochemical substance reacted with concrete, nettle, and stagnant water, triggering a process of rapid, abnormal crystallization. Mineral growths crawled up cracks in the asphalt, along dead root systems. The water dripping from the white branches did not evaporate, but solidified, forming not ice, but the thinnest calcite stalactites. Decades later, the city was no longer white or dead. It turned into something else. It was a forest of fossils and crystals. The skeletons of the trees were covered with druses of a translucent, smoky quartz-like mineral. The walls of the buildings were overgrown with needle-like crystalline structures that shimmered in the rays of the sun with all the colors of the rainbow, an ironic return of stolen pigments in inorganic form. Entire caves of amethyst and malachite formations grew up inside abandoned buildings where water accumulated. The heart of the plague, eventually breaking through the surface, towered in the center of the city with a huge, shimmering, ever-growing geodesic. The city is not dead. It moved into a new phase of existence, becoming a silent, sparkling monument to a life that found a way to exist even after its own death, turning into an eternal cold stone.